All right, everyone. So in this small lecture, I want to go over these namespaces idea and kind of focus a bit on this self concept. So if you feel pretty comfortable with what this self is using and how each of these are individual, then you could go ahead and go to the next video about creating constructors. If you're a bit iffy on what's going on and you might need a bit more help with it, please watch this video to get an understanding of what's happening. And in general, in the most basic form, essentially, when we're working with classes, each class is going to have its own namespace. What that means is that each class has its own instance, very similar to how all of us have our own instance of attributes as well. And the way that Python does namespaces essentially is by referencing this self command. So self helps give us a namespace that each my class instance can use. And down here, if we see the general form of our Python class statement, we're going to first start off with our class name. If we have a shared class attribute here, that might be one. And then we have our variables and then our methods as well. And in general, based on the notes as well, every time that we create a class, we're essentially creating a new namespace. And last week we talked a bit about namespaces with how if we have a variable declared inside of a function, we won't be able to access it outside of that. It's similar to that one as well. Now, how do I actually access the namespace of my class here? Well, the way that you're going to do that in Python is if you run our code that we created here, and I actually just type out my class, we'll see here that I'm getting the namespace of my class. Now, there's a few different things that can happen inside of your classes when you're working with them. If you type out a variable, a variable of your class, you will actually get the value back of it. However, if you type out my class.set2, and set2, where am I getting that from? Oops, sorry. In our code, we called it set version. You're actually going to get the bound method that exists inside of this namespace. So whenever we do this one, function my class at set version to this memory address, that's going to be getting us the namespace at this, or excuse me, the memory of our function at this namespace. Now again, to emphasize based on the notes as well, if I just type in my class or version or set version, we'll notice we're getting a name error because this isn't inside of our namespace. It's only within the my class namespace. Now again, if you actually create an object based off of my class, like so, and remember, the two parentheses instantiate the object. If I don't have them, this won't work for me. And I do a.setVersion, we'll notice here that we get a little bit more of a complicated bound method. So up here, my class.setVersion says it's a function.setVersion, a memory address. Now when I say a is equal to my class a.setVersion, my setVersion is now within the namespace of my variable a. And what this says now is bound method my class.setVersion of this my class object at this memory address here. So you can see there's a little bit of a difference here when I'm actually creating an object associated with it. Not a huge difference there, but the reason that we're doing this though is that if I create a second my class and I do b.setVersion, we'll notice that the namespace defined is different. We'll see that the majority of it looks the same, but at the end, 5490 for my memory, 5280. So what this tells us is that each of these have their own namespaces, and each of them have their own instance of these functions occurring. And again, that's kind of the main issue here, or not issue, but main idea behind self as well. So again, each instance object gets its own namespace and inherits attributes from the namespace of the class, and this is the general class called my class. And again, when we instantiate the objects, we are going to have individual and unique instances of things. So again, version isn't shared between us. Set version isn't shared between all objects. It's shared in the namespace of a single object. So again, when we're working with classes in Python, we're really working with namespaces, and we map the invocation of a method to a function defined in the class namespace. Cool. And again, you can abstract this out a little bit more. Instance.method is actually the same into the interpreter as class.method. We're actually passing it into this class method, so we're giving it to this namespace over there. Nice. Now, in general, the self variable is inside of the class definition. So the self argument in the class method refers to the instance making the method call. And so the self xxxx prefix in front of instance variables, so whenever we're having self dot something, refers to the instance namespace. So again, that's if I have my class, this is going, the self is referring to a, And now if I have another my class, the self is referring to the B, and these guys are individualized from each other. And that's why we're able to change the version of these and have them be different, right? Set version to 15, a.get version. And then if I do b.get version, we'll have a 1.0. So we have a little bit of a difference there. Nice. So that's namespaces and Python. What I would say to really get an understanding of it is try to create and fill in these missing statements. You don't need to submit this anywhere. It's just good practice to see what's going on. And definitely get familiar with what happens when you don't provide these parentheses there and what might happen if you do this one in comparison to the other one and so forth. Most likely, my class.version is going to return the namespace of this variable existing, whereas x.version will return the value for you. Awesome. So in our next one, we're going to be looking at writing constructors and finally making our own classes.